So, speculative fiction is a kind of clumsy term at this point. It used to be a wide catch all term for what we now call science fiction, but back then, science fiction had a different, it played a different role in stories. Science fiction was more of a what if thing, where the great theme, the big point of science fiction was to speculate about some future event or some important change to society and extrapolate from that. If everybody could fly, how would society look? That kind of stuff. And that kind of slid into the background of science fiction, replaced with ray gun blasters and lightsabers and spaceships, teleportation, aliens, what have you. And it became, I wouldn't say a freak show, but more of a display case of interesting stuff more than actually taking some of those interesting things and speculating about it. Hence, speculative fiction. But the idea of speculative fiction has had a bit of a renaissance over these last, what, over the last decade, maybe? I'm not entirely sure. But movies and books have come to the forefront again for taking some concept and thinking about what it would mean if that concept was real. And to be perfectly honest, I think a lot of the credit for that falls on people like Christopher Nolan because they managed to take something that is not part of our world and make it part of our world in a, if not believable way, then at least a way that you could imagine if it was believable, it would be like this. And of course, one of the hallmarks of this, one of the crowning achievements, is Inception. What if you could enter someone's dreams? And not only does the movie do a great job at displaying how that would be, what it would be like, and what the consequences of entering a dream would be for those, both those in the dream and those outside it. But it also speculates about how society would be reshaped by it. Both the actual center piece of it, the Inception mission, where they are supposed to place an idea, the fact that this becomes a corporate tool for manipulation and espionage, but also the scene where they are taken to see how a certain sedative is used, and it's a lot of people who are just spending most of their time in dreams. And they remark that it's because at some point it's the only way to dream. If you've started down that path, you stop dreaming in a normal way, and if you want to dream, this is your only real option. And things like that are just some of the reasons why a movie like Inception shows what can be done when you speculate about a fictional concept. A lot of science fiction uses this as a kind of false pride that they claim to be speculative fiction, but they're really not. They don't really speculate about the things that they present. They just take them as toys and make them entertaining, which there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just not speculative fiction. And there is still some kind of, I don't know if it's academic or artistic or what it is, but there is an aura of respect within many creative communities for the ability to take something and really speculate about it rather than just making it a fun detail. Star Wars never speculated about the consequence of having lightsabers, for example, one of the most recognizable elements of those stories. But that didn't take away from the story, it just meant that it wasn't what it was about. Speculative fiction, the reason I picked it is that there is early on in the story I'm working on, the grand story of Embassy of Time. Why do I get tired when I do these videos? I wasn't yawning before I did the video. Same thing last time. All the time before that, I don't even remember. But anyway, there is a question or a situation that I sort of came to the conclusion would have to happen in one way or another through future history. And rather than just saying, oh, this happened and now we go do something in a funny world, I wanted to explore it. And it turns out that speculative fiction is kind of difficult to do. It easily becomes just a tour, a freak show of various weird technological or societal trends. But when you're telling a story, if you want to tell a story that is speculative fiction, you need to get into the depths of something that is central to the what if question that you're asking. If it is what if people could fly, you need to get into the idea of people flying from a different angle than just the entertainment angle. To trace it back to the whole fundamental talk about genres, the very basics of speculative fiction will very often be about what does this what if question do to affect the opportunities and challenges that our main characters are facing. If people can fly, how does that change the options and hurdles presented to the main characters? If it's a murder mystery in a place where people can fly, how does the whole flying thing affect not just the investigation, but the society around it? If people can fly, then things like how could they escape, how could they get in somewhere become very different from if people couldn't fly. The possible explanations for actions could be very, very different from the world that we know. The laws could be different. Different laws could be broken in the process of the murder because people flying would mean that there will have to be regulations. Or if there aren't any regulations, there would be consequences of it. Peeping toms, burglaries, jaywalking would be a nightmare. And how does even something like architecture change when you no longer have to enter a building at street level? If you have a 12-story high rise building, and people can fly, then there would be doors on every level, most likely, or landing pads, or whatever, and people would have to secure them, which would mean that a crime scene would look very different because even though you're on the ninth floor, the outside is likely going to be secured against people flying in. It's not just about, okay, someone got killed and people can fly, so the action is going to involve flying. Not if it's speculative fiction. If it's just a plain action sci fi thingy, then you can get away with a lot more. People are not going to ask the same questions. There would likely still have to be some changes to it. If people can fly, then they can get in different places, but it wouldn't have that central a role. It would be more an action set piece. It would be something people do, not something that the world is. But in speculative fiction, you have to ask all the questions. And the fact is that even though speculative fiction is mostly thought of as a sci fi concept, it doesn't really have to be. Speculative fiction could be about what if certain kinds of magic are real. There was a movie, I don't remember the name of it, that was very much speculative fiction, and the core speculation was what if science proved beyond a doubt that there was an afterlife? And there were a lot of conclusions that the movie came to, the things like people willingly dying because they wanted the afterlife instead of the life they had, and a lot of things about religion and other beliefs crumbled or changed to adapt to the idea that you could actually prove and you could actually peek into the afterlife without dying. That was a massive change to society. And in most ways, that was not science fiction because it didn't lean heavily into the science of it. It leaned into the consequences that this revelation would have to society at large, to how people thought, to how people acted, to what people did. I don't remember the core story of the movie, but I do remember a lot of the examples of what this revelation did to society. And you can do that with a lot of different things. Actually, some genres are technically just a certain kind of speculative fiction that have been more defined, like post-apocalyptic fiction. That starts out with the question: what if society had been wrecked by something? And if you view it as speculative fiction, then you start having to deal with more detail around what wrecked society. And what kind of effect does that have on society? What kind of effect does it have on the characters? What kind of effect does it have on the story? The what if questions tend to carry speculative fiction, but they are not the story itself. And that's an important distinction to make. Speculative fiction is not a plot genre. It is a world genre, as it defines a world that has a certain core difference from ours. A certain core element is changed. That is the what if question. But you could actually push it to be one of those meta genres that could take any other genre and ask, well, what if we change this specific thing and just really run with it? The reason it's probably more closely tied to science fiction is that running with it usually has to involve some kind of, perhaps not scientific, but at least rational speculation about how things would change. If you just take something and say, oh, it changes this, and therefore we have this because we want this in the story, then it's not speculative anymore. And it's just an excuse for having some fancy thing in your story. The speculative part and the logical reason why things are the way they are after the what if scenario has entered the picture. That speculation leans so heavily into logic and rational deduction, or rational induction, technically, that the concept of speculative fiction lends itself most closely to science fiction. But you can have it in other places. There is a later part of the story that uses speculative fiction on fantasy. One where it does it a little bit, and one where it does it quite a bit more. The little bit is where it takes the usual fantasy setting and speculates what if things had gone really wrong, and basically constructs a kind of post apocalyptic fantasy world. But the one where it's more deeply ingrained into the setting, into the world genre, is where the what if question is, what if magic was simply taken for granted as a part of society and was essentially mass produced on an industrial scale and used in an industrial way, in many ways a form of magical cyberpunk. And that requires understanding your magic in the story in a different way from the usual fantasy magic where it's just spells. Now it's a societal driving force. But still, because it is magic, the speculation is kind of undermined because it's magic. It's whatever you want it to be. You're not restricted by any kind of rational limitations. So it becomes perhaps on the surface speculative, but if you dig deeper down, it's still a quote unquote freak show that just happens to have a what if question asked about it. When doing speculative fiction, the what if question should be asked over and over again, and the answers should be essential to the story. The themes of the story, the unique situations of the story. As I said, the options presented to the main characters should be greatly affected by the what if question. If people can fly, what kind of opportunities, what kind of obstacles are created for the main characters? It's nice enough that you can speculate about the world, but you're telling a story. What does this do for the characters? What advantages do they get from it? And what disadvantages do they get from it? Of course, speculative fiction being speculative fiction, there are no clear-cut answers. And of all the genres, I think speculative fiction is the one where the answers are mostly to ask certain questions. It's not that clear cut because it is speculative. You're supposed to break the mold, supposed to venture out beyond norms. That's the whole point of it, as it was for science fiction for a long time early in its heyday, back when science fiction exploded onto the scene. It was a lot of speculation. What if this? What if this? What if this? And that is what speculative fiction is. What if this happened? What would the consequences be? What would we experience? What new options would we have? What new obstacles would we face? How would the world change? And what would that mean to us, to the main characters? So, speculative fiction, it's a lot of questions needing answering, and then you take those answers and use them as the things I've already discussed. I think I'll keep it to that, even though it was a bit more vague than I'd like. But that's the nature of speculative fiction, I guess.